Hello, I'm Virginia Living's book editor, Bill Glose, and today I'm here at the University of Virginia with Bruce Holsinger, author of A Burnable Book. A Burnable Book is a medieval thriller that features the poet John Gower as its protagonist and Geoffrey Chaucer as a main character. So let's get right to it. How would you describe this book?
Well, A Burnable Book is a story of crime and corruption. It's a story of urban vice. It's also a love story, a story of friendship and betrayal. But above all, it's a story of a book, a dangerous book of prophecies, each one of which foretells the deaths of one of England's last 12 kings. And the last prophecy in this book is about the death of the current king, Richard II. He's only in the 8th year of his reign. He's only 19 years old. We're in the year 1385. And the story is about the hunt for this dangerous manuscript through the streets and the alleys and the halls of London. The protagonist, John Gower, is a real historical person. He was a poet. He wrote in 3 languages. He was a friend and contemporary of the greater English poet, He was a friend and contemporary of the greater English poet, Geoffrey Chaucer. And the book is very much about their friendship, even as it's about this dangerous pursuit of this perilous manuscript through London. It has subplots that take place in medieval Italy and medieval Spain, and it all converges in London and Southwark and Westminster.
What restrictions did you face in writing a Romana play?
Well, that's an interesting question because it very much involves contemporary political figures who are real historical actors. So John of Gaunt, the Duke of Lancaster, his mistress at the time, Catherine Swynford, even Richard II, the king, is a character. So, you have to, when you're writing historical fiction, you really have to respect the historical record. You have to respect chronology and place. I don't think there's any points where I violated a known historical fact about these figures. You're obviously taking liberties because you're writing fiction, you're not writing history. But I stuck very closely to the facts as I could discover them and as historians have known them.
So what kind of liberties did you take?
There were few liberties with particular characters. For example, there's one character named, her last name is Reichner. This is a transvestite prostitute who was active in, I based this on a historical character who was active in London and Oxford in the 1390s. But I changed that character's first names a little bit, and I messed around with some of the details, but I make that very clear whenever I do take liberties. You want to make that clear to the reader, and I use the historical note at the end of the book for that. Mm-hmm. I suppose the biggest historical liberty I took is simply this is a thriller and I invented the plot. So I invented this book called The Book of the Deaths of English Kings, the Liber de Mortibus Regum Anglorum. I wrote it in Middle English verse, and that's the book that everyone's looking at. So that's a complete invention, but without that there would be no plot.
Right. In addition to Eleanor/Edgar, the Swerver, there was also a lot in here about maudlins and jakes and prostitution, and we can't say the name of the lane that where all this took place, but it's quite graphic.
Yes.
How did all that play into
Well, that's based very much on medieval language and the language of the medieval urban sex trade. The street name that you mentioned that we can't say on video was a real street in medieval London that went by a really obscene name, and people referred to it as such. I did take some liberties with some of the language, the lingo of the urban sex trade in medieval London, simply because we don't have much of it that survives. So prostitutes are called maudlins because Mary Magdalene, whose name was pronounced Mary Maudlin in this period, was imagined in medieval legends to have been a prostitute in her former life, and Jakes, the equivalent of Johns in our modern parlance. Swerver is someone who would be a cross-dresser. So I based it on the way that Middle English uses words, but I had to invent some of my own.
Right. The London frequented by your protagonist, John Gower, was really 3 different locales. Yes. What can you tell me about them and their place in history?
Yeah, so medieval London was actually 3 cities. It wasn't just London. It was also the city of London, the walled city, as well as Southwark, which was you kind of call it a suburb across the river. It was known as an area of vice. It's where the large part of the urban prostitution trade was located. It was also where all the butchers were sent after legislation was passed earlier in the 14th century. Kind of a haven of ne'er-do-wells, not quite in the city, not quite apart from the city. Then you also had Westminster, which was the royal capital, which is where Westminster Abbey was, which was where the great royal palace of Westminster was. So those three different districts form one metropolis, which in this period didn't have that large a population. So even though it was the largest city and the largest urban area in London, it was still a kind of a small world, and it's the sort of place where King Richard could run into John Gower. And in fact, John Gower tells us in one of his poems that that encounter did take place, and I imagine that in the pages of a Burnable book.
Mm-hmm. You make reference to several other major events of that time, the Peasants' Revolution, the 100-Year War. How did all these things play into the disgruntled nature of the poor in London? Oh,
very much so. So 1385, which is the year that a Burnable book was set, this is only 4 years after the Great Rising of 1381, the Peasants' Revolt. And during that rebellion, tens of thousands of urban workers flowed in from Kent and from the other surrounding shires, and they took over the bridge. They torched the great palace of the Savoy. This was John of Gaunt's palace on the Thames. They killed a number of very high royal officials. They almost killed King Richard. So we're only 4 years out from that, and the discontent is still very much a part of the urban culture in London. There's a lot of paranoia about it. John Gower writes about the Peasants' Revolt in his Latin work, the Vox Clamantis, and I use that as the kind of script for his own imagining of the peril of the population of London.
Mm-hmm. Your previous writings are academic books on medieval culture and literature. What different skills did you have to bring to bear in writing a novel?
Well, the writing of fiction is a very different enterprise than the writing of academic prose, which can be pretty stodgy and has its own conventions. So really when I'm writing fiction, I'm telling a story. And I suppose I'm doing that a little bit in my academic work. One of the big differences, I think, is research. The kind of research that I'll do for academic writing is deep and thorough and very, very focused. And the kind you have to do for historical fiction has to be very broad. So you might be writing a section on somebody getting up in a saddle. And if I'm writing about that, I'll think, I actually don't know anything about what a saddle would be like in late 14th century England, so I have to go research that. But it's not as if I'm going to spend several weeks doing that. I might spend a couple of hours making sure that I know exactly which kind of saddle was used at this particular time. So it's, in some ways, the research is superficial, but it's also very, very broad.
Mm-hmm. And when you did the research, did anything catch you by surprise?
That's a really good question. I think the thing that surprised me most was my own ignorance about the period. I've been teaching medieval literature for more than 20 years, but there were so many details of daily life that I just, that came as a surprise to me, or that I realized while I was writing particular scenes that I just didn't know. Mm-hmm. So I think the extent of my own ignorance was maybe the biggest surprise.
Plagues, witches, wars, and the worlds of historical fiction. You taught this class as a massive open online course to over 20,000 students. How did you get involved with that, and what was that experience like?
Well, this actually came right out of the leadership crisis that the University of Virginia went through a couple of summers ago. And one of the reasons that our president was temporarily ousted by the Board of Visitors was what they saw as her reluctance to support online education and move quickly enough. So we ended up getting some outside grants from some donors to sponsor these large open online courses, these MOOCs. And I taught one of the first ones for the university, and I wanted to design a course that would allow me to explore historical fiction from a number of angles. So I combined a survey of historical fiction as a genre, all the way from the 18th century and the early 19th century with Sir Walter Scott, with some close readings of some contemporary historical fiction by 5 guest writers who actually came and visited with my class here on grounds or virtually. They included my colleague Jane Allison, also Geraldine Brooks, a Pulitzer Prize winning novelist, as well as Catherine Howe, and several others. So that was a really extraordinary experience to have the students here at the University of Virginia interacting with those authors. And the reason it could happen was what you could kind of call the leveraging power of the massive online course.
Right. What do you want readers to take away from reading a Burnable book?
Well, what I want most is for people to know that they've gotten a great story and that they've kept turning the pages. It's a thriller, after all. Again, it's not a work of history. By the same token, I do want people to get maybe a richer sense of medieval London and of the Middle Ages than they have before, and also to appreciate the power of writing and the power of literature. As a Burnable book is above all a book about books. It's about the power of poetry and of prophecy and the power of the written page.
So I understand you're also working on a sequel. Or is there anything you can tell us about that? Any little teaser?
Yeah, absolutely. So the deal that I signed for this actually requires me to write a sequel, which I was very happy to do. We don't know a title yet, but I can tell you that I'll tell you two things about it. One is that it begins with a very grim discovery of a pile of bodies in the privy channels, the sewer channels of medieval London. And the second is that it's about the beginning of gun violence in the Western world.
Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us. Once again, the book is a Burnable book. It is published by HarperCollins. It is available in bookstores now, and the author is Bruce Holsinger. Thanks again.
Thank you, Bill. It's been a pleasure.